Thank you very much. I'm glad that everyone had some coffee and some sugar before my remarks. I'll begin by saying it's an honor to be here in Bucharest. It's an honor to be speaking to the International Association and to be working with Dimitri Cantemir Christian University. I'm grateful to the rector and to the conference organizers and the staff. Also grateful to my Arizona State University colleague Ileana Orlich for suggesting that I contribute remarks. It's also an honor to be speaking to an association of my American colleague Tim Sellers. He's a former president, and in part I will be drawing on some of his scholarship general approach to what is called Republican theory about international law and international relations. This will be, I suppose I could begin by invoking the great philosophical troupe Monty Python by saying, in contrast to Professor Leiter's remarks, now for something completely different. For those of you who know, good. At least I know you're awake. Just a remark about that. Montesquieu, the topic of my remarks, and the Republican tradition, as it might be called, is if you think of Raphael's School of Athens, you could imagine in relation to Professor Leiter's remark, there would be Plato pointing up, Machiavelli pointing down, and Aristotle in the middle. And behind Aristotle's shoulder would be Montesquieu, following in his wake. That we needn't accept a stark choice between Plato and Machiavelli. There's a reasonable middle ground. Finally, I will note that today, July 4th, is an important moment in my country, America. It's the anniversary of the date in 1776, 246 years ago, that America issued its Declaration of Independence. And I hope you will accept that this is not just nationalism or chauvinism on the part of an American, that the Declaration of Independence is an important moment in the history of philosophy of law and of social philosophy. In the Zoom version of this association's convening in the fall, I contributed remarks on Montesquieu, on the theme of Montesquieu as the father of constitutions, as the scholar Judah Schlar referred to him. And I argued that in the 21st century, scholars of constitutionalism, legal and social philosophy should rediscover him precisely for the principle of moderation, the reasonable middle ground, as he called it. As philosophers, and then philosophers advising statesmen and legislators, we should avoid extremes in human affairs and in philosophizing. We could translate his idea of moderation as a philosophy of complexity, of the necessity for striking balances within the broad parameters of natural right, as he understood it. Today, given that we are convening in Central Europe when it is under attack and at war, I will extend that theme to suggest our urgent need, both philosophically and practically, to rediscover Montesquieu's philosophy of moderation as he applied it to the rights of war, peace, and international affairs. Since roughly 1800, there has been a successful philosophical and practical effort to build a liberal international order that is defensible. Correct the translation of my title. It is meant to be a defensive, but more broadly defensible, liberal international order, defensible against illiberal and despotic powers. That intellectual and political effort since 1800, while successful on a global scale, of course has faced great challenges across the way. On the way to Bucharest, my wife and I recently visited northern France, Normandy, in part to see the American and British-led D-Day landing sites on the beaches in 1944, the start of the campaign to retake Western and Central Europe from Nazi totalitarianism. 80 years later, Ukraine and Central Europe now are embroiled in a barbarous war unleashed by an illiberal neo-imperial power. This is a power that the Transatlantic Alliance and other liberal powers, alliances, and institutions knew very well, but failed to deter in the past decade. This failure occurred not only among policymakers, but also among intellectual and academic elites across the liberal democracies. And such a failure of thinking and policy indicates that we should reconsider the true foundations of the defensible, effective liberal order that gradually has been built and extended to many parts of the globe in the past 2 centuries. My argument is that the jurist and philosopher Montesquieu is the father, now neglected, of this civilized right of nations, and the father of a defensible liberal order. He is neglected because our academic culture, in the liberal constitutional democracies especially, has grown too focused in the past century on extremes of modern thought, especially in our discourse about international affairs of war and peace, but not only in that area. The 2 dominant schools in international relations theory, the 2 rival extremes, are rooted in a neo-Machiavellian realism about power and calculations of interest, and at the opposite extreme, a Kantian moral utopianism of law and morality governing a peaceful discourse of diplomacy and commercial interests. Given that academic and policy discourse about international relations has been dominated by the stark alternatives of these extremes of thought, it is not so surprising that in the post-Cold War era, both America, as the greatest liberal constitutional power, and the liberal alliances and institutions that it leads, have descended into confusion. We have failed to understand, manage, and deter the illiberal powers of neo-imperial Russia, communist authoritarian China, and illiberal authoritarian Iran. What we should rediscover is that the sober liberal international order now threatened, and the great powers which have built and sustained it since 1800, are the fruit of a third philosophical approach, the reasonable middle ground. An approach more complex and balanced because it's attuned to the enduring realities of human nature and of international politics. This sober but still liberal philosophy thus prescribes a more realistic balance between the necessities of deterrent defensive power on the one hand and the ideals of peaceful, lawful commercial order on the other. Montesquieu is the neglected father of this complex liberal right of nations and of the federative alliances, the United States and NATO, most crucially, that have successfully defended liberal constitutionalism against several authoritarian and imperial threats. An advantage of this more prudent philosophy of a defensible liberal order is that its approach or its perspective is closer to the realities faced by actual liberal statesmen and policymakers, and thus it provides a better foundation for the particular judgments such leaders must make, the balances they must strike in a dangerous world. Montesquieu's effort in The Spirit of Laws, first published in 1748, was to propound a philosophy of international right that declared principles of right to govern war while promoting peace and commerce. And he argued that this is a balanced, moderate philosophy that would support the conditions for a defensible international political order favoring individual and political liberty. Montesquieu's right of nations, the phrase he used, right of nations philosophy about war, peace, commerce, and international affairs, draws substantially, if quietly, on a medieval just war set of principles from Augustine and Aquinas, as adapted by the modern jurists Grotius and Pufendorf. The argument is that rulers and governments must strive to balance the higher principles guiding a decent, non-barbaric politics with the practical realities of defense against illiberal aggressors. My further argument is that this approach to international affairs, as developed and channeled through Montesquieu, explains the opening statement of principle on international affairs in George Washington's farewell address from 1796. This was drafted for Washington by Alexander Hamilton and reviewed in its near final form by John Jay. And James Madison also had a hand in it, so really the 3 people working to help Washington. All 3 of them distinguished lawyers who knew very well the spirit of laws. So this is the opening statement of principle from Washington, 1796, about foreign policy. Observe good faith and justice toward all nations. Cultivate peace and harmony with all. Religion and morality enjoin this conduct. And can it be that good policy does not equally enjoin it. It will be worthy of a free, enlightened, and at no distant period a great nation to give to mankind the magnanimous and too novel example of a people always guided by an exalted justice and benevolence. These are the words of a victorious general in war, who later became the first president of the American Constitutional Republic, holding the single executive power as the commander-in-chief of the armed forces. My point is that Washington knew war and he knew power, and he wanted America to be a great power. So he was not a Kantian who thought that the only rational future was one in which war must disappear. But neither was he a Machiavellian, a narrow realist. Washington's statement of an American grand strategy, rather, is Montesquieuan, moderate, balanced, looking toward a modern international order of capable, defensible, liberal governments, whether monarchies or republics or some blend, cooperating under a recognized international law that is defined by principles of natural justice and morality. Under the influence of this right of nations philosophy in the past 2 centuries, liberal governments and allied moderate states have sought to reduce the role of brute force while elevating the role of peaceful commerce and law. They have done so through legitimate force and deterrent capability, as much as through norms and institutions of international law. This story is so substantially forgotten in our era, especially by the dominant trends in academia, which have largely relegated Montesquieu to a second-tier philosopher. In fact, it's even forgotten by Montesquieu specialists. That I will offer my argument in reverse order, so to speak. I'll begin with a sketch of why we might bother to rediscover this reading of Montesquieu's philosophy. Then I'll turn to a brief examination of the Spirit of Laws itself. Montesquieu announced near the end of the Spirit of Laws that moderation, or finding a reasonable middle ground among extremes, is the guiding principle of his political philosophy, and I quote, "I say it, and it seems that I have brought forth this work only to prove it. The spirit of moderation ought to be that of the legislator. The political good, like the moral good, is always found between 2 limits." In practice, or in effect, seeking moderation in politics often involves blending or balancing or reconciling seemingly rival principles. As mentioned, beyond this theoretical claim about Montesquieu, I will add a second contention that his moderately realistic, liberal Republican philosophy of international affairs in fact has shaped the sober grand strategy and foreign policy established by the founders of the American Constitutional Republic, and further, by guiding American grand strategy across centuries, Montesquieu's philosophy also ultimately shaped the sober liberal world order sought by Cold War American policy and then actually achieved since 1991 during the post-Cold War era. Montesquieu, of course, would be pleased by this record of actual influence. He also would not be surprised by the persistence of brutal, authoritarian, or despotic powers in international affairs who are challenging any such international order. His influence on the global liberal democratic alliance and the world order it has built teaches us that we need not reduce our aims to the level of Machiavellian brutality and realism, either our theoretical, descriptive aims or our practical aims. It teaches that decent liberal republics and their allies can be defensible, powerful, and persuasive in enticing others to cooperate in a liberal order. But the Montesquieuan philosophy in its record also teaches that Kantians, it teaches those of us who are Kantians that we cannot rely solely on the articulation of rational principles and theory and diplomacy. Having just been shocked in 2022 by Vladimir Putin again, after the transatlantic alliance has repeatedly failed to heed the Montesquieuan lessons about deterrence and vigilance against illiberal powers, we need to rediscover Montesquieu's sober balance between ideal principles and effective military capability. It is no accident that 2 of the architects of this approach to international relations were jurists, lawyers, first, before becoming philosophers, Grotius and Montesquieu. They laid the foundations for a liberal Republican school of international relations, a more complex and balanced approach because, having been lawyers and judges, they were attuned to the enduring realities of human nature and of international politics. Thus, they prescribed a more realistic balance between the necessities of deterrent defensive power on the one hand and the ideals of peaceful, lawful, commercial order on the other. Montesquieu's right of nations philosophy, including his principle of federative alliances, is evident, as I mentioned, mostly in the United States and NATO, and most crucially evident, but not exclusively in those alliances. So now I have a section of the paper on the distinction between prudence and liberal moderation in international affairs on the one hand, and mere or pure realism on the other. The philosophy of moderation developed by Montesquieu and by his philosophical heir, Alexis de Tocqueville, is more attuned to statesmanship and prudence, thus attuned to the limits of theory, than are other versions of liberal philosophy. We might say that Hobbes is the father of the school of realism, Kant the father of liberal internationalism or idealism or institutionalism. They do not feature this attention to statesmanship and prudence in their actual philosophical works. In contrast, both The Spirit of Laws and Democracy in America, 1835 and 1840, both these works cite Plutarch, his Lives of the Noble Greeks and Romans, for moral insights on statesmen and statesmanship. Both of these works seek an equilibrium between historical reflections about human nature and liberal philosophizing about them. Thus, both Montesquieu and Tocqueville wrote philosophical histories. Montesquieu's is Considerations on the Causes of the Greatness of the Romans and Their Decline, which was a prelude written in the 1730s, a prelude to his great work, The Spirit of Laws. And Tocqueville cites the Considerations as the model for his own philosophical history at the end of his life, the Ancien Regime and the Revolution. Here I note, because we're speaking at Dimitri Cantemir University, that Montesquieu, in his personal library, which I've just visited, owned a 1740s French translation of Dimitri Cantemir's History of the Growth and Decline of the Ottoman Empire, the title of which is quite similar to that of Montesquieu's History of the Romans, Consideration of Causes on the Greatness and Decline of the Romans. There is a historical puzzle here about influence. Cantemir's work was completed in 1717, but it was only published by his son in 1734. That was the same year that Montesquieu published his history. So one speculation is that Montesquieu learned of Cantemir's History of the Ottomans from his son, an ambassador for Russia to London, and Montesquieu and he met in London. And one wonders whether Cantemir's work influenced in some way, certainly the title of Montesquieu's history. But now, back to the idea of philosophical history, of a kind that is neither Kantian nor Hegelian, arguing that history must, if it's to be rational, must conclude, inevitably will conclude at one liberal moment. The Spirit of Laws is a different kind of philosophical history. It cites many actual exemplars of prudence and moderation. His general aim, he says, is to educate statesmen by warning that great souls who are moderate are rare, but they're not impossible. Hegel, in his philosophy of world history, celebrated the audacious Napoleon as a world historical figure, and he completely ignored George Washington, a more moderate historical political figure. Tocqueville, in contrast, in Democracy in America, retained Montesquieu's more moderate spirit. Tocqueville praised the moderate framers of the American Constitution as including the finest minds and the noblest characters that had ever appeared in the New World, and he elevated one in particular, wanting to note that George Washington presided over this constitutional convention. He deems The Federalist, inspired by Washington's statesmanship and written by three of his protégés, as, I quote, a fine book that, though special to America, ought to be familiar to statesmen of every country. And it's not accidental that Tocqueville's first use in Democracy in America of his important concept of enlightened self-interest, arises precisely when commenting on Washington's advice for foreign policy and his character. It is true that Montesquieu noted in The Spirit of Laws that the spirit of republics is peace and moderation. He seems to mean here modern republics, post-Christian, because he certainly knew that there were republics who had the spirit of war and expansion. He says that is the spirit of monarchy, war and expansion. This remark generally about the spirit of republics is not a proto-Kantian moralism about abolishing war. The author of the Consideration of the Romans knew about a warlike republic. He also refers to Thucydides, so he knew about a warlike expansionist democracy. Moreover, in The Spirit of Laws, he describes the modern polity that he examines most closely and largely recommends England as a blend of monarchy and republic. His analysis offers this kind of historical complexity and offers an effort to balance larger principles with the practical necessities of particular policies. Precisely the blend that a liberal democratic modern statesman would appreciate. The contrast to our now dominant academic theories in international relations is stark. One could say that realism does not care that one is theorizing about or guiding a liberal constitutional democracy, since in the realist theory, international affairs concerns only the interests and powers of states and the balances and calculations about them. Realism presumes that a statesman is from anywhere, everyone being natural adversaries to everyone else. Liberal internationalism, at the other extreme, deems our liberal character as entailing construction of global institutions and binding international law, thereby granting only a minimum scope for a state and statesmanship. Liberalism at the opposite extremes. If realism assumes we're from anywhere, liberalism at the opposite extreme assumes we are from everywhere. Thus, we are global citizens. In this sense, neither school really advises on a foreign policy for liberal democracies and their alliances, for actual liberal states with both ideals and interests. This persistent confusion in both theory and practice led Henry Kissinger, putatively and long known as a realist in international relations, to recently reconsider the fundamental principles for a grand strategy that should guide the global liberal democratic alliance. In his 2014 book, World Order, Kissinger argues that American foreign policy or strategy must balance power and principle, must balance pragmatic concerns and ideals. He seemingly admits in the work that America always has done so, seeking to achieve an enlightened self-interest in international affairs. Kissinger's late work is a significant step toward recovering the moderate approach that Montesquieu developed and that, in fact, has shaped American grand strategy across 2 centuries. The interests, ideals, and peoples of the liberal democracies now span the globe. The system of independent states tied by law and commerce that is dominant, if barely so, in international affairs is largely the fruit of Anglo-American policies, principles, and then alliances that ultimately date to the British Empire and the American founding. It is striking that at that founding, while America was young and weak, Alexander Hamilton, writing as Publius in The Federalist in 1788, called America to oppose European imperial power. America as a new state should vindicate the honor of the human race and teach that assuming brother, the Europeans, moderation. As this story has unfolded across 2 centuries, America and its liberal democratic allies have not left the world alone. And we are now rediscovering in the post-Cold War era that the world and history, whatever that is, are unlikely to leave us alone as we might have liked. Moreover, much of what we take for granted as familiar and just, global commerce and relative prosperity at home, cheap energy, the internet and social media, freedom to travel the globe, great power, peace, natural rights, human rights. These are provided by a global order sustained by Anglo-American power and influence and the broader alliances and federations built. institutions as well, built by the leading liberal democracies. But because the Liberal Democratic Alliance has grown distracted and confused in the post-Cold War era, we have allowed authoritarian and despotic powers to threaten this peaceful global order. A return to first principles, in particular to grasping how Montesquieu's right of nations philosophy shaped Washington's statesmanship in founding American foreign and security policy, may help the Liberal Democratic Alliance to chart a grand strategy more consonant with our ideals and character and with our just interests. That is, more consonant with enlightened self-interest. America was the first deliberately founded polity in human history. It would be odd if her rise to global dominance in both hard and soft power justified some kind of amnesia about her original aims and the philosophy that originally guided her constitutional order and its grand strategy. That said, Tocqueville was worried in the 1830s that America could become confused and distracted. He worried that we had already by then signaled we might abandon Washington's principled prudence articulated in his farewell address. He hoped nonetheless that America might combine liberal principles and power to be the global pillar for liberty, rather than turning inward. At the end of the first volume of Democracy in America, published in 1835, he predicted that a century hence America would oppose a sole global rival, Russia, standing for authoritarian rule, with each power holding, and I quote, the destinies of half the world in its hands. This prescient insight occurs just after a subsection in that long chapter entitled, Tocqueville's title of this subsection, Some Considerations on the Causes of the Commercial Greatness of the United States. This was a philosophical inside joke. It's a paraphrase of the title of Montesquieu's Philosophical History of the Romans and their thirst for conquest. Tocqueville thus signaled Montesquieu's influence both on America's character and on his own political philosophy. In the remaining time I have left, I do want to leave some time for questions. I'll just quote some passages from Montesquieu's Philosophy of Moderation in the Spirit of Laws, in case you think I'm just imagining this. From Book 1 of the Spirit of Laws, international right joins two other species of law that Montesquieu defines as necessary for a philosopher to understand law and politics. You can't understand just one or just two. You must comprehensively understand all three. So international right joins political law or right, constitutional or public law, we might say, and civil law, criminal or civil law right, as we might say. This complex approach to incorporation of international right adopted a legacy developed by Aristotle and Plutarch, then by medieval theories of just war and prudence, as articulated by Augustine and Aquinas. But as I mentioned, Montesquieu seems to be particularly shaped by Grotius, who drew on these classical and medieval sources to expand the first modern jurisprudence of international law on the rights of war and peace. Just one point here. Montesquieu is often studied, if at all today, in international relations theory as emphasizing one principle, commerce. Somehow a proto-founder of the commercial peace theory or democratic peace theory. As I've argued, Montesquieu is more complicated than that. He's deliberately more balanced. The entire work is written as if to say, no one principle under than moderation, the principle of balancing principles, should guide our understanding of law and philosophy. He conceives of a liberal polity, whether monarchy or republic or a blend, that can pursue tranquility at home and commercial expansion and power abroad. Just to save time, a remark about the influence that figures like Grotius and Montesquieu, jurists turned philosophers, wanted to have on actual statesmen. Richard Tuck's account of the widespread influence of Grotius, The Rights of War and Peace, published in the 17th century, influence beyond scholars to statesmen, notes in the introduction to the Liberty Fund edition that General Washington, like most well-educated gentlemen, possessed a copy of Grotius on his own library shelves. A further remark on the influence that this approach had to combine liberal, peaceful, commercial conceptions of a state with power. Paul Ray, historian, philosopher, American scholar, has argued that Montesquieu's considerations on the Romans prepared Montesquieu to devise this larger philosophy of international right of nations in the spirit of laws, because it helped him to study the problem of a realm, Caesar, Kaiser, Tsar, that aspiration. What Montesquieu was looking for, Ray argues, is a modern Carthage. This time, a modern Carthage, this time commercial and capable of deterring and defeating a neo-imperial power, be it Tsar, Kaiser, or other ambitious authoritarian. And this is why Montesquieu saw the monarchy Republic of England as harnessing commerce and military and naval power as the modern Carthage. Just a brief set of remarks on the structure of the Spirit of Laws, which I hope all of you will, it's available on Amazon. Just seeing if you're still awake. Book 9, when Montesquieu turns from thinking about the history of political philosophy and understanding regimes or governments, in Book 9, Part 2 of the work, he begins to speak more in his own voice. What is the moderate kind of government, political order, both domestically and internationally? Book 9 is about defensive questions in international relations and his idea of federation, which can easily extend from a domestic confederation to an international confederation, so to speak. Book 10 on offensive force in international relations. And then Book 11, more widely read, a constitution, a domestic constitution devoted to liberty. The influence on the American, talk about causal relations of political philosophy, direct relation, all of this has a very direct relation on the American constitutional republic and the structure of our constitutional order. As I mentioned, George Washington as a single executive with the commander-in-chief holding a fairly long term, but the power to declare war is lodged in the legislative branch. And the legislative branch is given the power to define offenses against the law of nations. In Book 1 of the Spirit of Laws, Montesquieu lays out the central importance both for realistic description and for a philosophy that accords with natural right or natural law about international relations. And I quote, "Human beings, considered as inhabitants of a planet so large that different peoples are necessary, they have laws bearing on the relation of these peoples with one another, and this is the right of nations. The right of nations is by nature founded on this principle, that the various nations should do to one another in peace the most good possible, and in war the least ill that is possible, without harming their true interests." And one more quotation before leaving some time for questions. Montesquieu claims that the right of nations developed by modern, moderate governments, an actual historical reality, is, in contrast, less vicious and barbaric than the right of nations, say, specifically of the Romans, as he describes it. And he argues that Christianity, whether one believes it or not, is an important causal historical influence on this development of a more moderate, humane right of nations. One of his final remarks on the topic seems idealistic for crediting Christianity for humane principles to moderate politics. He says, "Human nature can never be sufficiently grateful to Christianity for developing this relatively more moderate approach to war." And this extends, however, to a principle of religious toleration or religious liberty. This new right of nations in war, he says, quote, leaves to the vanquished these great things: life, liberty, laws, goods or property, and always religion when one does not blind oneself. Well, I'd be glad to take questions about, especially more in the final section of the paper. It talks about how this, in fact, has influenced this moderate approach to the right of nations has influenced American grand strategy, not just during the founding period, but even into the late 20th century. The historical fact we know that President Eisenhower, right? Eisenhower, the first Supreme Allied Commander of NATO, becomes then President of the United States. Eisenhower directs his staff in 1959 and 1960 explicitly to read Washington's farewell address when Eisenhower wants to present his own farewell address in either late 1960 or early 1961 as he finishes his 2 terms as president. And from Eisenhower's writings, we know that he wanted to capture this philosophy of moderation or balance, the need to reconcile and balance important principles. And if Eisenhower could do this, a commanding general in war in an era of ballistic missiles, nuclear weapons, submarines, aircraft, right? He thought this philosophy from 2 centuries earlier was perfectly adequate to cope with, be adapted or updated to cope with new technologies and new global circumstances. So if it's good enough for Eisenhower to think it strikes a balance between ideals, liberal democratic ideals, and being realistic, I recommend it to us. Thank you. Glad to take questions. Whoever gets the microphone, it's not my choice.
So it works. My name is Lorenz Schulz, University of Frankfurt, and I want to start that I appreciate your talk. I appreciate that Montesquieu is indebted for his concept of balancing powers to antiquity, Roman, and not to enlightenment. And I appreciate that in the end you mentioned the Christian tradition being important for Montesquieu. Because I think his main criteria, or an essential criterion for civilization in Montesquieu, is that a crime has to be accompanied by atonement. And in the history of criminal law, it's mainly indebted to the high Middle Ages, scholasticism, saying that crime is against the will of God. It has to be atoned. I do not find this idea in the Roman age or in antiquity. Now, I wonder about 2 things. First, moderation in a Christian perspective is mainly represented in Christian theology by incarnation. You know, the authority of the monotheistic God being unbounded, as we later find it in the voluntaristic tradition and in Hobbes' in the secular version, and incarnation means to set bounds on the power of God. So my first question is whether this is a correct intuition. The second question is, you didn't mention the separation of power thesis that is mainly affiliated with Montesquieu. I think it's correct that separation of powers in Montesquieu is indebted to the Roman idea of a mixed government, mixed constitution. Senators and the people's voice in Rome. Is it correct that our modern idea of a tripartite separation of power is not to be found in Montesquieu? You find it, let's say, in Kant as a syllogistic scheme, and that I think the idea of a tripartite separation of powers is very modern, as you find it in, let's say, international criminal law. You need an independent court. So how about your idea?
Sure, I'll take that last point first. Thank you for your comments. In fact, Montesquieu is the father in political philosophy of the idea of an independent judiciary. He's the first philosopher, before Kant or anybody else, to explicitly say that a moderate form of government ought to have three powers. Now, this is a complicated argument in the spirit of laws, because he seems to say that in a portrait of England, that they have three separate independent powers. But I think there's a larger, we would say, normative philosophical argument throughout the rest of the book. And the first book that I wrote about the judiciary makes this argument, that the entirety of the 31 books of the Spirit of Laws makes this argument very clear. There can be no moderate form of government, monarchy, republic, blend, unless there is an adequately independent judiciary. The first set of remarks that you made, Montesquieu is not a Roman thinker per se. He's aware of Rome, influenced by Cicero, for example. The considerations on the Romans is a severe critique of Rome. He's trying to dissuade any decent, moderate Christian Europeans to not aspire to be a Tsar, a Kaiser, a universal monarch, any such figure. So I think I'm probably a small subset of Montesquieu scholars who thinks of him as very influenced by medieval Christian philosophy, the Aristotelian version of it. I was just at his private library, which has been moved from his chateau to the municipal library in Bordeaux, and I held in my hands his copy of both Summas. He owned his own copy of the Summa Contra Gentiles and the Summa Theologiae of Aquinas. This is not to say he was a Thomist, but he's, again, through Grotius, influenced by this idea that an Aristotelian Christianity can be alert to the realities of power and politics, the realistic dimensions, so to speak, of human nature, and can devise ideas. So, for example, the separation of powers and federalism are both balancing principles which are realistic, not, let's say, Platonic or Kantian. So.
I have a microphone.
You have power.
So I would like to thank you very much for this extremely inspiring and wonderful talk. I'm a little bit familiar with your book on moderation, which I found also very inspiring. My thought is that, and I really share with you the need to focus on Montesquieu, also in the field of international law and international relations. I think I would be more reluctant in opposing Montesquieu to Kant. I think one could create something, an interesting dialectic between Kant and Montesquieu. Still, my question is whether these moderate philosophers, and for whom you plea in your presentation, have a conception of substantial legitimacy, terms of substantial legitimacy in structuring the moderate, let's say, world order. What should one expect from a state eager to participate in this world order as far as it's fulfilling its terms and requirements of legitimacy? This would be my question.
Thank you. Well, it also responds a bit to the first question. I think of Montesquieu as an Enlightenment philosopher. I use the terms modern and liberal about him, but distinguished as part of the moderate Enlightenment. And so I am putting Kant in the more radical category of the Enlightenment. But that they're both Enlightenment philosophers means that they should be able to have a conversation. We should be able to have a conversation about what points they share and what divergences they have. In terms of institutional structures, I think that's your question, for a more moderate, decent international order. Montesquieu generally is, we could say, a gradualist or a meliorist regarding politics. He has explicit statements, somewhat like the Deputy Secretary of NATO, suggesting we should have a conversation across civilizations about fundamental human principles, ideals of right and justice that we could share across civilizations. He has explicit statements at the beginning of the work and throughout that no one form of government or institution could be just for all peoples. There's such diversity among human peoples. On the other hand, he explicitly states what is to be avoided, despotism and barbarism and brutality. So it's finding, the work is left to us as scholars, statesmen, in particular circumstances, to work to ameliorate. He seems to suggest if you try radical changes, this is 40 years before the French Revolution, which he could see brewing, the discontent for quite legitimate reasons, he thought, with the Bourbon monarchy. But radical changes, he critiques the attempt at a radical change in England and its constitutional order a century earlier. He compares Cromwell to Caesar. This was not going to work out well. Right? It's too radical a change. So being meliorist and gradual, I would apply that, so I'm making an analogy, I would apply it to his view of international relations. Could you over time move from what he was familiar with, treaties, works like Grotius, his own attempt, to spread that set of principles, to expand the circle of nations, states, monarchies, republics that abide by that, and slowly develop institutions. So I'm suggesting he would be very happy with NATO. I think he'd be happy with the United Nations to the extent that it has a balance of principles. General Congress of Nations with a great power, Security Council, and there's a limit to what you can expect of the institution, right? Whoever gets the microphone.
Hello, Luís Pereira Coutinho. Thank you for your talk. I generally sympathize with your approach. I just find it hard to harmonize the different dimensions because you seem to need a normative approach of political regimes accompanied by a realist approach of international relations. What would the possibility of harmonizing both in a theory of liberalism of fear, what would your answer be to that? And the second point, I agree that both Montesquieu and Tocqueville acknowledged the relevance of Christianity, but I would quarrel with the idea that moderation only emerged with Christianity. For instance, Thucydides is usually read as a bare realist, but one can a more profound reading would lead us to the idea of moderation, with the idea that no interests can really be pursued without moderation. I would say that the whole point of the Millian dialogue is that. Thank you.
Thank you very much. I'll start with that last point. I entirely agree with you about Thucydides. It's a cartoon caricature of Thucydides to say that he's advocating some sort of realism, that he thinks the Athenian view earlier and then in Book 5 is the accurate view of human nature, war, peace, international affairs. Just textually, right? The final brutal act at Milos after the dialogue. The very next words at the beginning of Book 6. The next winter, the Athenians went to Syracuse. Right? The immoderation of the Athenians points to their obliteration, their self-destruction. So I agree with you, it's a principle of moderation. Thucydides is working out a principle of moderation, and that's the possession of all time. So I put Thucydides and Montesquieu in the same general approach. That leads to the second point, which is that I think Montesquieu as a philosopher looked for sources of moderation wherever they could be found in the history of human thought and the history of human practice. So I think he didn't write on Thucydides very much. He mentions Thucydides in the Consideration of the Romans. But what can you take from Aristotle? What can you take from Cicero? What can you take from these Christian authors versus those Christian authors? He even cites Alexander the Great as a model. Montesquieu is belles lettres. So he has a sense of irony, and he has to be read very carefully. He points to Alexander. If you're going to be a conqueror, he says, take Alexander as your model, not Caesar. Alexander was a very moderate conqueror. I mean, your first point, right? These are categories, we can't think that way. We just, out of bounds, red flags go up, we stop, we can't read anymore. But he knows that there are people like, Abraham Lincoln said this, right? There are Napoleons and Caesars out there, and as far as we know, they always will be. Whatever their names are, whatever their cultures. How do you deal with them? Well, one way you deal with them is say, okay, you want to be great. Why not be great for being more moderate than these barbaric? Don't be a Putin. Be something more moderate. Yeah, we could disagree with it philosophically, but it's a different philosophical approach on the need to reconcile what seem to be opposite principles.
I have the mic, so I'm taking this opportunity. Over here.
Oh, thank you.
Yes, sorry. So Takeman, Rotterdam, Netherlands. I want to take you in a slightly different direction. As you eloquently show, and I really love the attention from Montesquieu, which I think there can't be enough of. That's really very helpful, and also for moderation. But you say that there's a middle ground between sort of war and peace, but commerce is on the side of peace. And I think that in Montesquieu's time, this was quite a common view, to see commerce as leading to peace or helping peace. But if we look at the world today and the imperialism of today, or actually the past centuries, couldn't you also say that commerce is wedded to war and imperialism? And what would Montesquieu have to say about that point?
Thank you very much. I'm coming across as if Montesquieu has an answer for everything, but you got to test it out because there's explicit argument in the Spirit of Laws about this point. I think philosophically he wants to be careful about the practical realities of being received as an author. He can't be as critical of the French Bourbon absolutist monarchy as he would like to be, although he's plenty critical and he got in trouble for it. Right? He can't be as critical of Christianity as he might perhaps have wanted to be, but I think he also wanted to say you can go too far. Right? He's repudiating Machiavelli, Hobbes, others for going too far. Right? So his criticisms of commercialism and greed in international affairs, he's brutally critical of the Spanish. Less so of France's colonies abroad and England's colonies abroad, for example. Brutally critical of the Dutch for their commercial extremism, not of England. Right? He wants to be received in England, thinking his philosophy might spread if adopted, widely received in this cousin, as he thought of the Anglo-Saxons and Normans and Anglo-Saxons in England. So there's explicit critique of how commerce and imperialism fit together. He explicitly criticizes, it's interesting, the less read chapter on England in Book 19, at the end of Book 19, explicitly criticizes the English imperialism toward Ireland without ever mentioning, if there was a neighboring nation, he says about that, right? Persecuted not only for their Catholicism, but because the English want to control the ports and the commerce, to have domination over it. So quietly, carefully, he's warning that even the English, who seem to be relatively moderate and a good model They're not by any means perfect. And the Dutch, the Dutch commerce domestically and then internationally, the Dutch have made themselves inhuman. Everything has a price. There's no courtesy, there's no humanity, there's no politeness. I guess maybe time for one more.
Thank you very much for this really convincing appreciation of Montesquieu, and I would like to pose a question concerning his main work, Spirit of Laws. Isn't it the outcome of this philosophy of moderation that at the heart of all political decisions and actions lies this idea of laws? And I wonder, what is his picture of laws? Isn't it a sort of also a third middle way between thinking of laws as an ideal, as one side, not moderate side, and thinking of laws as only contingent, what we are told today also by Brian Leiter, it's all, everything is contingent, laws are only, you can do everything with laws. And I think he's in a middle ground. He says laws come out of some sort of more broad wisdom and tradition, and so not everything is immediately contingent. You can change laws, but to be moderate in a third way, you have to overcome radical positivism and a radical idealism about laws.
Yes. So this is, the prior question that mentioned Thucydides and, harmonizing principles. I used this phrase, enlightened self-interest. I didn't read the passage in Book 10 of the Spirit of Laws on use of offensive force, conquest in international affairs, trying to moderate the Roman view and say, he articulates a principle that he calls the law of natural enlightenment, which wants us to do to others what we would want to have done to us, which is a kind of consequentialism, you might say, blended with idealism. About human affairs. And then the principle that I extended, that Tocqueville articulates, I think he takes that from Montesquieu, this idea of enlightened self-interest, which explains commerce, but also the larger view about war, peace, international affairs that Montesquieu holds, Tocqueville finds it in Washington, and the Americans at their best. So I would trace that back to Aristotle, as I said, right? The School of Athens. Aristotle's in the middle, that to understand theoretically, philosophically, the concept of law as only ideal or only material contingent reality is not to philosophically understand it correctly. The phenomenon of human law is this blend of the two. It can't be law without capturing both of those dimensions. And then the further principle, which I think is arguably evident in Aristotle, and in Aquinas, but less of a note. Montesquieu makes it more emphatic, that philosophically and according to natural right, it cannot be the case that the same set of laws are correct for this people over here and this people over here, because of the need for laws to adapt to customs and mores, and as I mentioned earlier, to be meliorist and gradual toward reform, in the direction of according with a universal set of principles about natural right. Right? But my own view is that that's Aquinas. Right? Aquinas has regard for positive law and for human law. It just always must be judged against the general principles of natural law. But the general principles of natural law are very general, are very broad. Okay, last one.
Stefan Carrese, Austria, Salzburg University. I wanted to join the chorus of colleagues who agree with you, mostly, but I would only agree to 50%. And the other 50%, I think, are missing. And for an analysis of the current crisis of liberal democracies are not less important. You introduced us, or reminded us of Montesquieu as the big scholar, the important scholar for the principle of legality, of the principle of moderation, which is closely connected. But if we speak of the current crisis of liberal democracies, we also have to refer to the principle of democracy. And I'm afraid Montesquieu doesn't have much to say about this.
Now, you said that Montesquieu is not the solution to all our problems, but since the contemporary crisis is also a crisis for democracy, it's not sufficient to simply refer to the principle of moderation, legality, and what is connected, but also to some democratic aspects, which even Tocqueville did not cover because he had a rather instrumental conception of democracy. So maybe you could elaborate a little bit into this.
Thank you. Fair points. The larger argument would have to show that Montesquieu was an influence on the Declaration of Independence, as well as on the Constitution. The two chapters on England were published in 1750. Paul Ray, this is not original to me, Paul Ray has worked all this out. The two chapters on England, the study of the Constitution of England and then the moral, political, social effects of that set of laws in Book 19. Those were published in a separate translation as a kind of separate booklet in English in 1750. Ray thinks that David Hume may have had a hand in that. And that was sold like hotcakes in London and Britain and in America, along with Nugent's translation into English of the whole spirit of laws. So that's 1750, and then so figures like Jefferson took handwritten notes, copied out passages from 29 of the 31 books of the spirit of laws. So Jefferson turns on Montesquieu later as too critical of democracy or popular consent. But there's an argument to be made that Montesquieu's view of constitutional moderation fits with a clear articulation of natural rights of all human beings. But Montesquieu would also understand that American statesmen in that set of circumstances would need to articulate that in their own way. So it's a philosophy, a political philosophy, about the limits of philosophy. There are general articulations you can make, and then there would have to be more specific articulations. I find that in Aristotle and Aquinas. About democracy, democracy can go to extremes. He knows of Athens. That, now it's not a complete full democracy, right? But the principle of consent to the governed, if taken too far, can be too much of a good thing. That's Montesquieu's view. And so I think he would appreciate the American framers in their attempt to have democratic consent, so to speak, as a principle of the states, state and local government, of the House of Representatives, and then it's moderated or balanced by the federalism principle, by the more aristocratic republicanism of the Senate, of the executive, and then of the judges, the independent judiciary. So that would be, and Montesquieu is very much influencing Tocqueville's view. I think Tocqueville appreciates equality, but thinks the institutional means to achieve a more egalitarian political order should be moderate, balanced means, otherwise democracy can be self-destructive. My major point there would be American politics is partly self-destructive right now because we have too much small d democracy in how we choose presidents, senators, especially. I'll mention two names, Bernie Sanders, Donald Trump. Angry, extreme, in a certain way, yeah. Thank you.